Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's a beautiful day for a wonderful conversation with Shannon Burke. She's going to give us a presentation on amphibians of Marin, which I'm sure we're all excited to hear. I know I am. This session is being recorded. It will be up on the Marin County Free Library website and possibly on the County Parks website too. We'll have it on the Marin County Free Library actually YouTube channel within 2 weeks. You can look for it there. If you have any questions, you can of course email me, and I'll put my email in the chat. Thank you for staying muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will read them out at the end when Shannon takes questions. And I think that's it. With that, Shannon, do you want to get going?
Yeah, sounds great. Okay, so hello everyone. Thanks for tuning in. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Shannon Burke. I'm the Interpretive Naturalist with Marin County Parks. And why isn't my screen? So Marin County Parks manages 34 different preserves and 39 different parks. And so we're kind of scattered all around the county. And we offer different programming. So we have ranger events and we have volunteer days, and I do naturalist walks, and then lectures like this as well. So if you want to find out more about us, you can visit our website. And today we're going to talk about amphibians, and we're going to focus on amphibians that are found in Marin. And here we have 11 species. So well, I'm kind of going to do a general overview of amphibians, and then we'll sort of do a general overview of each of these species. So amphibian, the word amphibian comes from the Greek words amphi and bios. So amphi means of both kinds, and bios means life. So this refers to the fact that there are two different distinct stages in the amphibian life cycle. And so the larval stage is aquatic, like the tadpole stage, and then the adult stage is terrestrial. So one thing to kind of get out of the way first is what's the difference between amphibians and reptiles? So lizards and salamanders can look quite similar, kind of superficially, but there are some general characteristics to help differentiate between these two really different groups of animals. So reptiles have scales, and they are active in the dry, warm season, so like summer, typically. And then also they have these great claws. So of course snakes don't, but things like lizards and even tortoises and turtles and all of that have claws. And amphibians don't have claws. They've got just these nice sort of nubby toes. And they have really smooth skin, so they don't have scales, and they need moisture. And so they are typically active in the wet season. So during winter, for the most part, when we get rain and we get water collecting in areas. One of the reasons for this is because amphibians actually do a lot of their breathing through their skin. And so they're actually able to absorb oxygen and release carbon dioxide right through their skin. And in order for that gas exchange to happen, the skin has to be moist. And so they need to be in moist habitats and active during the wet season. So amphibians are visual predators. And so they are carnivores as adults, and in some cases as larvae as well. And they kind of need something to move for the most part. If they're going to feed on something, it has to at least whittle a little bit. So here's a fly, and then here is this frog getting that fly with this big sticky tongue. And you can see that sort of sticky mucus that helps catch insects. So some amphibians have fairly short tongues like this, and then some have what's called a ballistic tongue. So especially this group of salamanders that are called the Lungless Salamanders that we'll talk about in a little bit are kind of the stars of the show when it comes to these ballistic tongues. So they have these really long tongues, and there's actually bone in that tongue. And then at the very tip is this tongue pad, and it's super, super sticky. So that helps them to, pick up whatever they hit. And this happens really, really quickly. And the way that it happens is they contract all of these muscles, and basically it pushes the tongue out. It pushes that skeletal section of the tongue out, and just in the flash of an instant, it can nab an insect. So amphibians also, a lot of amphibians secrete toxins, and on toads like this one, they have a parotoid gland, which is really obvious in this red circle. You can kind of see that big lump. But toads and some frogs and some salamanders are able to secrete toxins, and that helps to deter predators. And so it causes an irritation in the mouth, and it just is basically a really unpleasant taste as well. And amphibians also secrete mucus, and so they do this in part of it is to help keep themselves moist, right? So like I said, their skin has to stay moist, and so if they secrete mucus, it just kind of helps retain the moisture in their skin. It also makes them really kind of slippery, and so it's easier to get away from predators. It also helps to keep things like bacteria and fungus from infecting them. And it also just kind of acts to gum up the mouths of predators. And so if they, get, let's say, bite off the tail of something like the salamander, then it would gum up the mouth and actually allow the rest of the salamander to get away. So speaking of that, a lot of people are familiar with the fact that lizards can regrow their tails, but amphibians are kind of the masters of regeneration. And so toad and frog tadpoles, if they lose part of their tail or if they lose a leg while they're developing in that larval stage, in the tadpole stage, they can regenerate those limbs. They can regenerate that little leg or a tail. And salamanders can actually do this throughout their whole life. So as adults, if they lose a leg or if they lose their tail, and a lot of times this happens if a predator is trying to get them, predator will end up putting pressure on or sort of biting that tail. And it has a way of kind of a quick release. And so it can break really easily and wiggle around. And then the rest of the animal, like, the head and the body and the legs and everything can get away. And so then they can actually regrow those limbs or that tail. And so you can see here on this slide, the stages that it goes through. So first the wound kind of heals over, and then the cells actually de-differentiate. They're turned back into stem cells instead of forming scar tissue, which most animals do. And then those cells kind of take the cues from the surrounding cells to figure out what they should grow into. And then ultimately they start producing skin and muscle and bone. So when a lizard loses its tail, it grows back with cartilage instead of bone. And the muscles are a little bit different and the skin is different. But if a salamander loses its tail, it actually regrows those vertebrae and it produces the same kind of skin and the same kind of muscle. And so it's just kind of like the original, which is pretty amazing. So obviously scientists are studying this. Okay, so let's jump into our different species. So we're going to start off with frogs, and we have a few different species of frogs in Marin. And the most common is the Sierran treefrog. So these are these cute little frogs, and they're the ones that do that typical ribbit sound. If you think of the sound of a frog, you're probably imagining one of these. And they can be green, they can be brown, they can be kind of a copper color, they can be mottled, but they all have this nice black stripe through their eye. When they're cold, they can be really dark, kind of black, and when they're warm, they typically are brighter. They can change color to a certain extent. So for instance, if you have a green tree frog and it's on a bright green piece of vegetation, it may appear brighter. And then if it's moving around in dead vegetation, like dead cattails or something, it can turn a more dull kind of brownish green. So a little bit of ability to change color. So Sierran tree frogs like sort of still, calm water. And so they're found in pools and lakes, ponds, things like that. And even if they're in a creek, they tend to be in deeper pools that have slower moving water. And they'll even breed in, and so I should say this habitat that I was just describing, that's the breeding habitat. So this is during the wet season where they gather. And then they also will even take advantage of ditches by the side of the road and puddles. And sometimes you can find tadpoles in areas like this. And so you can imagine that these types of bodies of water dry up really quickly. And so they have to go through their life cycle, transform into adults pretty quickly, go through metamorphosis. So in the rainy season, all of the frogs that have been, spending the summer in the dry months in a sheltered, moist, cool place, like down in a rodent burrow or under a rock or in a rock crevice or under a log or something, they will kind of emerge. And typically the males make their way first to bodies of water. And they usually return to the area where they were born. They kind of imprint on their natal area. And even it might be that same lake or pond or anyway, some body of water really close by. And so the males gather first and they start singing. And so in the Sierran tree frogs, they've got this big air sac underneath their throat, and that fills with air, and then they vibrate that, and that helps them produce that sound. And so they sing. And so if you have a whole bunch of males gathered and they're singing, it's really easy for the females to locate them, right? They just basically head toward the sound and they're going to find males to mate with. So only the males sing, and they typically stay in the water for most of the breeding period, and the females come down just to breed and then basically leave again. And so a female tree frog might come down, lay her eggs one night, go back on land, and then come down the next night, lay some more eggs with a different male, and might do that a few nights in a row. So because the throat puffs out on the males, they're actually really easy to identify. So their throat, when it isn't puffed out, all of that skin is wrinkled and it's black like this or dark. And then the females have a nice pale throat that's a lot smoother. So when they breed, the males grab onto the back of the female, and this is called amplexus. And so when amphibians are kind of joined like this with the male holding onto the female, that's called amplexus. And in frogs and toads, they have external fertilization. So the female releases the eggs and the male releases the sperm, and then the sperm swims through the water and fertilizes the eggs. And there's this period of time where the eggs are permeable, and it's really brief. And so the sperm have to get there pretty quickly. And then once they're fertilized, then they harden off. And then at that point, they're no longer able to be fertilized after those first few minutes. So the frog life cycle is pretty typical for amphibians. So they're a good example, the Sierran tree frog life cycle. So starts off as an egg, and then inside of the egg, the embryos develop, then eventually they hatch into a tadpole, then they go through metamorphosis, and then they turn into an adult. So that's the general life cycle. So the eggs of Sierran tree frogs are kind of this really soft jelly mass. It's just a small little cluster of eggs. And one thing to notice is on the top side, they're black. And if you think about it, that's good camouflage if you're looking down into a pond. So if you're let's say a bird that's thinking about maybe trying to find some yummy eggs to eat, if they're dark, they're going to be harder to see against the dark background of the water. And the other advantage is that it provides solar radiation. And so that dark color absorbs heat better, and that actually helps the eggs to develop more quickly. And it also provides kind of UV protection. So it almost acts as sunscreen to keep the eggs from being damaged from ultraviolet light. And then on the underside, they're light colored. So if you imagine a fish looking up and the light sky is above the water, they would be well camouflaged with this pale coloring underneath. Okay, so then they hatch out of the egg and they turn into the larval stage, which is the tadpole. And in frogs and toads, the gills are internal, so they're actually inside of the mouth, and they pull in water, and then that water has dissolved oxygen, and it flows over the gills and the gills absorb the oxygen, and then there are little spiracles, little holes kind of on the side of their head that the water is pushed out of. And as tadpoles, they are herbivores. And so they have a really small little mouth, and they eat algae and sort of decaying plant material, things like that. And this is a close-up of the mouth. They have these little ridges, these little cone-like structures, and then in the center, sort of these larger scraping organs. And so they're able to just kind of scrape algae off of rocks and things like that. And then eventually, they start to develop legs. So the front legs actually develop first, but they stay under the skin. And so the hind legs emerge first, and that probably helps them to swim around better and move around. And then they start to go through metamorphosis. And so what happens here is at this point, they've got all four legs. So on the left side, you can see this individual is going through metamorphosis. And you can see all four legs. It's starting to look more like a little frog. And so it actually starts to grow lungs. It develops lungs so that it'll be able to breathe when it's on land. And it absorbs those gills. And it also transitions from being an herbivore to a carnivore. And so the whole digestive system actually changes. It goes from being this sort of long intestinal tract to a shorter tract. And also their mouth changes. So from that little small opening to a big gaping mouth to catch insects, right? And so during this time, they don't feed because they're going through these really dramatic changes. And they live off the fats and the proteins and the different nutrients in their tail. And so slowly they absorb their tail. And then ultimately they transform into an adult. And they start off as this tiny little froglet. So they're super cute. So this little individual at this point would have lungs. It would have a fairly large mouth that can open. And it's a carnivore at this point. So after the rainy season, as things start to dry up, the newly emerged little froglets and the adult frogs all leave the area, the breeding area where the water is, and they move into the terrestrial habitats, and they find, again, like rodent burrows or crevices in rocks, or just some cool moist place where they can spend the dry months. And they just kind of shut down their metabolism, and they don't feed, they aren't very active. They just kind of wait out the dry season. Okay, so the next species we're going to talk about is the California red-legged frog. And this is a federally endangered species, and it's found here in Marin in a few places. And this is a pretty big frog, so especially in comparison to that tree frog, it's pretty good size. And these guys can take about 7 months to transform. And so unlike the Sierran tree frogs that transform into adults pretty quickly, like I was saying before those puddles and things dry up, this species takes a lot longer to metamorphose. And so they require permanent pools. And a lot of times they take advantage of stock ponds and little bodies of water in agricultural land. So these are found out along the coast and around the bay, and also in some inland spots in the county. And one thing to note about them is that they've got what's called a dorsolateral ridge that runs from their nose to the end of their body. And so it's this really distinct ridge, and that can help you identify them. And also habitat, of course, plays a big part in identifying them. And they have big clusters of eggs. And so out of a cluster like this, one might survive to adulthood. And so that's kind of why they're producing so many eggs, is that they, risk predation and things drying out, and just different things that can affect them or, impact them and kill them basically before they become adults. So they transform into larvae, and they've got this nice big sort of fin that starts from the middle of their head and comes back. And so they look a bit different from the tree frog tadpoles. And then the foothill yellow-legged frogs, their fin starts back farther on their tail. So we will talk about them next. So the foothill yellow-legged frog is a California species of special concern. And one thing to note right away is that they don't have that dorsolateral ridge. So they look different from the red-legged frog. And here's that in comparison. And then also, if you were to look on the underside, the red-legged frog has red and the yellow-legged frog has yellow. And these are individuals that were photographed by people studying them. And these frogs are, I believe, still actually alive. So no harm. Anyway, another thing to note between the red-legged and the yellow-legged is habitat. And so typically they're found in pretty different habitats. And so the foothill yellow-legged frog prefers streams that are fast-moving and cool and highly oxygenated. And so sometimes you find them near waterfalls, like at Carson Falls. And they actually, because they're breeding in places with fast-moving water, it can be a little bit hard to hear their vocalizations above the sound of the water. And so they actually, for the most part, they vocalize underwater. And so that's a way for them to kind of locate each other. And instead of having one big air sac like the Sierra tree frog does, they have two air sacs. So you can see on the bottom picture, those two air sacs are flared out kind of on the side of the throat here. So they lay a big cluster of eggs as well. And again, out of that whole cluster of eggs that on average might be about 1,000 eggs, it can be less, it can be more, but typically maybe one of those is going to survive to adulthood. And in the non-breeding season, so during the breeding season, they're gathering in places with fast moving, cold, highly oxygenated water. And then in the non-breeding season, unlike the tree frog and the red-legged frog that basically leave the water and disperse to terrestrial habitats, these guys stick around the water all year round. And so typically they're along streams that have openings where the sun can come through because they actually like to bask in the sun. So they're typically kind of out of the water and just sort of one hop away from the water, though, so that if they feel threatened or a predator comes, they can jump in the water. But they're usually found around water all year round. And so I should mention that they might have a place where they're gathering during the breeding season, and then in the non-breeding season, they might disperse upstream or downstream to an area that is going to have permanent water and just the right sort of conditions for them during the rest of the year. But you can see here, they kind of look like a little blob of mud or part of a rock. So they can be kind of hard to tell or to see. But if you're walking along a creek and all of a sudden you hear a little plop, it might be one of these guys. But they are only found in a few places within the county. So at Carson Falls on MMWD land, Big Carson and Little Carson, and up in at Walker Creek, and then this area around Nicasio and Lucas Valley Road, those intersections. And then we just recently discovered a population at Cascade Canyon, which was really exciting. So in 2017, we discovered a frog there and have been doing surveys and have a good population going there, which is exciting. Okay, so not so exciting as the American bullfrog. This is a non-native invasive species. And one thing to look for on this is they're pretty big frogs, and they have this large eardrum, and they've got this kind of distinct little ridge that goes around that eardrum. So that's a good thing to look for on these frogs. And one of the reasons why they're bad news is because they will eat pretty much anything they can get in their mouth. And so this one is eating a lesser goldfinch, which is a type of small bird. And they will eat, they can eat mammals, they can eat birds, but they also eat our native amphibians and our native invertebrates. And so they're really making a huge impact on a lot of our native species and causing those numbers to drop. And their tadpoles are really big, as you can see from this one. So for the most part, these are eating plant material and invertebrates, but they will actually even eat the larvae of other native amphibians. So all in all, these guys are bad news. Okay, moving on to toads. So the general differences between frogs and toads is that frogs tend to have a slimmer body, whereas toads are just sort of a little bit more stout. And then also frogs have longer hind legs and toads have shorter legs. So what this means is that frogs generally jump if they're trying to get away from something, they jump, whereas toads kind of do these short little hops, or they'll even kind of walk. They kind of do this scrambling, which they can get going pretty fast, but not quite as fast as a frog jumping away. And then frogs lay their eggs in these sort of little clusters of eggs, these egg masses, and toads lay their eggs in these long chains, which you'll see a photo of in just a minute. So the only toad that we have in Marin is the California toad, and it used to be called the Western toad. So if that's causing any confusion for anyone, it's had a name change. But one thing to note is this light stripe that goes down its back. And so that's a really good way to identify this species. And similar to the frogs that we were talking about, during the dry season, they typically hang out in the rodent burrow or something like that, some protected moist spot. And they have something called a seat patch. So some frogs and toads have this where they're able to, in general, amphibians are able to absorb moisture through their skin. But on this one, it's really obvious. You can see what's called the seat patch. So what happens is, so there are toads that live in really dry habitats, actually. And so this is really beneficial for them. And so as they're sitting on the ground, if there's any moisture in the soil, this area, the seat patch, is highly vascularized. And so it can actually draw up that moisture from the soil. So they can absorb water through their skin rather than drinking, and take advantage of any moisture that's in that area. So similar to the Sierran tree frogs, these tend to breed in kind of cool, in sort of warm, still, calm waters. So here's a pair in amplexus again, with the male on the back, and generally the males are a lot smaller than the females. And here are these fantastic eggs that they lay. They're just these long gelatinous ribbons dotted with these black little eggs, and these strands can be several feet long. It's really spectacular to see these. And so here's a close-up of them. And then they transform into little tadpoles. And so the tadpoles, when they're young, are this sort of velvety black, and they're really smooth. And opposed to tree frog tadpoles, where the eyes kind of bulge out on the side of the head and they're more of a mottled brown. These guys are this black, and their bodies are more round, and their eyes are kind of in line with their heads. And then later, when they go to metamorphose, they start to get more of a brownish mottled color and start to look more like a little toad. And here you can see these great little legs that have come out. And then ultimately they turn into an adult toad, sort of. This is a tiny little freshly metamorphosed toadlet. And so again, at this point, this has gone from an herbivorous tadpole to a carnivorous adult, and it's gone through that whole transformation like the frogs have, with going from having gills to having lungs. Okay, so now moving on to the salamanders. So salamanders are kind of the most general characteristic that distinguishes them is that they have a tail. So we'll start by looking at the Pacific newts. So newts are a type of salamander, but not all salamanders are newts. And newts have lungs, and they also can do some respiration through their skin, like all amphibians. But I just want to point out that they have lungs, because in a little bit, we're going to talk about some salamanders that don't have lungs, actually. So there are Pacific newts, and here we have two of those species, the rough-skinned newt and the California newt. And they look really similar, but one of the easiest ways to differentiate between them is to look at the head and look at the eyes. And on the rough-skinned newt, their eyes don't bulge out. They're really in line with the head, and the top of the eye, sort of the eyebrow area, is brown. And on the California newts, the eyes are more prominent, and they typically have more of a yellow coloring, an orangey coloring above the eye. So here you can see a California newt. And this one is in breeding condition. So they breed in the water, and this one has been spending some time in the water. And so its skin looks fairly smooth, and you can see that nice yellow above the big eyes. And then this is a rough skin newt. And again, above the eyes, it's brown. The eyes don't bulge out as much. And this is in its sort of terrestrial condition. So this one hasn't been spending much time in the water at this point. And so its skin is rougher, and rough skin newts obviously have rough skin, but even the California newts, their skin is smoother during the breeding season, especially the males when they've been spending time in the water, and then has a lot more texture during the non-breeding season. So the Pacific newts have a toxin called, it's a type of tetrodotoxin, which is the same toxin that's found in pufferfish, which I'm sure most of you have heard is really, pretty nasty stuff. So it's a neurotoxin, and it can be lethal. And in these newts, it actually it's living in their skin, and it's produced by bacteria that's living in their skin. And so the bacteria lives in the skin and produces these toxins. And so it's a symbiotic relationship where the bacteria gets a place to live in this nice, moist environment, and the newt gets protection. And so they have warning coloration. Normally when they're walking around, they're brown on the top, they're really well camouflaged. But if they feel threatened, so if a bird were to sort of peck at them, or a mammal were to nose around, they might adopt this posture, which is called the Unken reflex. And what they do is they they throw their head back and they curve their tail over, and the orange underside is exposed, and that's warning coloration. And the toxin in their skin has to us, it has a mild pungent smell, but to other mammals that have a great sense of smell, it's probably much stronger. And then also any birds that might see this, see colors really well and can use this as a cue that this is probably something they don't want to eat. And if an animal has gotten a little bit of this toxin in their mouth, it's probably an irritant. I've heard of dogs that kind of cough and sputter after licking a newt. And so it's an irritant and it tastes bad and all of that. And so they would leave it alone. If you or any animal were to actually ingest one of these newts, you would die. And so what happens is that toxin actually sort of interferes with the nerve and muscular pathways and really quickly leads to respiratory failure where you just can't breathe anymore. So in the rough skin newt, when it does this posture, it curls up its tail. And in the California newt, it holds its tail straight. And so for the most part, rough skin newts are considered to be about 10 times more toxic than California newts. But there have been some studies in certain populations where California newts were actually found to be more toxic than the rough skin newts. Anyway, both have enough toxins to do a lot of damage. But there are some animals that are able to eat them. In particular, the common garter snake has a resistance to the toxin. And so you end up kind of in populations where you have newts and garter snakes in the same area, you end up with this arms race. And so the snakes build up resistance to the toxin, and in return, the newts end up becoming more toxic. And so their toxicity increases, and then the snake's resistance increases as well. And then in some areas where you don't have the snakes around and there isn't that pressure, the newts are a lot less toxic. And so there have been instances where things like bullfrogs or herons or raccoons have been observed feeding on these newts, and studies show that they are susceptible to the toxins. And so in those cases, it's probably just where the newts are less toxic in those populations. Okay, so these guys do have lungs. They gather in the water during the breeding season. And you might see these things called newt balls. So what happens is the males come down to the water first, just like in the frogs, and they spend the whole wet season in the water. And their skin gets smoother, their tail gets flattened so that they can swim better. And then a female just comes down when she's ready to breed. And so she spends a much shorter time in the water, because if she sticks around, she'll actually end up being constantly harassed by the males. So she just visits temporarily. And when she enters the water, she's releasing pheromones, and that attracts all of the males. And so they kind of vie for the chance to mate with her. And then ultimately, one hangs on successfully. And then instead of like the frogs do, where she releases the eggs and he releases the sperm, they do something a little bit different, the salamanders do. And so he ends up walking in front of her along the bottom of the pool or the creek or whatever. And he's in front of her, she's right behind him, and her nose is kind of nudging the base of his tail. And then ultimately he ends up depositing a little packet of sperm. It's called a spermatophore. And then he leads her over that, and then she kind of squats and takes it up inside of her. And so it's internal fertilization, which is different than the way that the frogs do it. And the rough skin newts lay their eggs singly. And so here's a little newt egg, rough skin newt egg, and it's attached to vegetation or a rock or something like that. And they tend to breed in faster moving waters with again, cooler waters and lots of dissolved oxygen in the water. And the California newts tend to breed in stiller waters, and they produce egg masses that have several eggs in them. So you can see here. And so this is kind of typical habitat for California newts. They can also breed in streams, but again, in deeper, calmer pools. And then eventually the little embryos develop, and you can see these itty bitty little baby newt larvae forming. And then when they emerge from the eggs, they're kind of like a little tadpole, but they've got external gills. You can see these fuzzy appendages behind their jaws, and their legs develop pretty quickly, and both the front and the hind legs come out around the same time. And then ultimately they go through metamorphosis And it's not as extreme as it is in the frogs and toads. They are carnivores as larvae, and so their digestive system doesn't have to change. And so basically their legs just get stronger, their eyes get bigger, they lose that tail fin, and they develop into a little miniature adult, and then they leave the water again for the dry season. They find a terrestrial spot to hang out. Okay, so our lungless salamanders. So we have three species of salamanders that actually don't have lungs. And so remember that cutaneous respiration? Well, these guys are pretty much doing all of their respiration through their skin. So through the outside of their body, and then also the lining of their mouth and the back of the throat. And so they're able to absorb oxygen, release carbon dioxide. Again, they need to be in a moist environment, but they actually don't breathe in the water because they would drown. So if they are submerged in water for long periods of time, they can't breathe because they don't have lungs. So they can be submerged temporarily, but really not any great length of time. So because they're not gathering in ponds and lakes, which is an easy way to find a mate, one thing that they take advantage of are these nasolabial grooves that are a characteristic of this family. And there are these little grooves that run from the upper lip sort of up to the nose. And as they walk along, they touch their nose to the ground. And if there's any moisture through capillary action, it's taking up all of these olfactory cues. So this is a great way for a male, for instance, to find a female when it's the breeding season. And then they go through courtship and mating very similarly to the adults, but they're doing it on land. And in these, they've got this really prominent, what's called a mental gland under their chin. The males have these. And so this releases pheromones. And they rub this, the male rubs this on the skin of the female on her top side. And it just sort of helps her to be compliant and get her into breeding mode. And this group of lungless salamanders are called the plethodontids. I love this photo. Anyway, so if you translate plethodonid, it basically means a plethora of teeth. So in arboreal salamanders, which is this one, they have really prominent teeth, and they will even scrape the skin of the female and then rub that pheromone. And so it's kind of like they're injecting the pheromone into her skin. And so similarly, the female will do what's called tail straddling and follow the male, and he'll deposit a spermatophore, and then she'll take that up. But again, all of this is done on land instead of in the water. And so the eggs are laid on land as well. And in this photo, you can see kind of those yellow areas. So they've got a big yolk sac. And the reason for this is because they go through the whole larval stage, the whole like tadpole stage inside of the egg. And the females typically guard the eggs in this group of salamanders. So they stay with them, and they actually help keep them moist. So they'll wrap their body around them to help them from drying out. And eventually they emerge as tiny little versions of the adults instead of tadpoles, because again, they've gone through that larval stage in the egg. And so this is called direct development. Okay, so the first species in this group is the Encetina. And this is a ring species. There are a lot of subspecies. So for instance, around the Central Valley, you can see all of these look really different. And where they overlap with newts, they look a lot like newts. So in Marin, a lot of our Encetinas look a lot like this, brown on top and kind of orangey underneath. And you can see the similarity to newts here. And the reason for this is those newts are toxic, right? So again, here's a newt on the left, the upper left, and the Encetina is on the lower right. So if you look like something that's really toxic, there's a really good chance that predators are going to leave you alone. And so that mimicry is really beneficial. And again, as I was explaining, they've got these defenses, so they can excrete mucus. And in this species, you can see all of this mucus that's being excreted on the tail. And so their tails break off at this predetermined point, the base of the tail. So if the predator is going after them and sort of tries to grab them, it can break right there, heals over really quickly, and then grows back. But again, that tail can be covered in mucus. And so if the predator ends up with that in their mouth, it can gum up their mouth while the animal actually gets away. So again, similar mating strategy and direct development in this species. And they can be in evergreen or deciduous or even oak woodland habitats, but in Marin, I think of them being really associated with kind of redwood habitats and mixed evergreen forests that are nice and cool and damp. All right, arboreal salamanders. These are typically brownish with little sort of light colored spots or flecks on them. And they kind of look similar to the ensatina, but different coloring. And the ensatinas and the arboreal salamanders and actually slender salamanders, which we'll talk about in a minute, are all nocturnal. So they hang out during the breeding season. Sorry, all times of year. They hang out at night during the day in protected spots, and then they emerge at night and they go around and they hunt. And arboreal salamanders have these sort of expanded toe pads, and it actually helps them climb, which is why they're called arboreal salamanders. So they can get all the way up in trees, pretty high up in trees. They can even lay their eggs in cavities in trees. So they're pretty impressive climbers. And then again, they've got these teeth, and this species has really strong jaws. And so if you're trying to catch prey, little different insects and things like that up in a tree, it's good to be able to get a really good grip on your prey so that you can get it in your mouth and not fall out of a tree, right? So again, the females will stay with the eggs, and the eggs on this species have these little stalks, and they're usually attached to the roof of whatever little cavity she has found to lay her eggs in. And these are typically found in kind of moist coast live oak woodland areas. But they can also be found in drier habitats like coastal scrub. And the advantage there is, even though this is drier, it still has that marine influence. And so a lot of fog is coming in and bringing moisture into these habitats. And then the California slender salamander is tiny. This is a full adult. And these kind of look like worms. And again, this is another lungless salamander. And so they take advantage of earthworm burrows. And during the dry season, they'll get down in those burrows. They'll lay their eggs down in those burrows. And they have these just great tiny, tiny little feet and big eyes. So again, they're visual predators. And a lot of times when you find them, they'll curl up like this. And so part of that is defensive, so that they're more compact, their body isn't exposed, their tail is wrapped around them. So if a predator were to go for them, they might not sustain injury. And then the other thing is it helps to keep them from drying out, so there's less surface area exposed. And these are one of the most ubiquitous vertebrates in the Bay Area. So there are lots and lots of these guys. And they typically are in kind of wooded habitats. And so you can find them under logs during the wet season. But they're also really common in yards. So they might be under paving stones or under, a potted plant or things like that. And so again, during the wet season, they're above ground. And then during the dry season, they kind of disappear. And then last, and definitely not least, is the California giant salamander. And so this is a salamander that has lungs, but their lungs aren't super efficient. So they do a lot of breathing through their skin. And they breed in the water, and the adults get huge. And so they can get about a foot long. This is the largest terrestrial salamander in the world, but there are aquatic salamanders that are about 3 times as big. But anyway, the largest land dwelling salamander. And they have a really wide prey base. So they eat a lot of invertebrates, but they also eat small vertebrates. So here, this one is, eating either a mouse or a rat. So they will kind of take advantage of pretty much anything that they can get in their mouths. And they breed in really fast, cold moving waters as well. And so you can find them where there's permanent water and it's moving pretty quickly. And so they lay their eggs under the water, and they typically get underneath like a big stabilized rock or even a log jam, or kind of down below the bottom of a creek down in the rocky areas, and they lay their eggs. And then they transform into aquatic larvae, and they've got big squared off heads like this, and then external gills and a nice sort of finned tail. And these take about 2 years to transform into adults. And so actually I'm going to go back. And so typically the larvae get to be about like 7 inches long or so when they go through metamorphosis and transform into an adult. But some, if they're living in an area where there's enough prey available and the water doesn't dry up and, you know, it's just a great habitat, they might actually become sexually mature adults, but stay in the water and retain some of their juvenile characteristics. So they will retain their fins, and they will retain the fin on their tail, and they'll retain their gills. And so these can end up being, you know, almost a foot long, these really big, what's called neotenic adults. And it's interesting, the larvae and the neotenic adults, even though they don't have lungs, they're breathing through gills, they have been recorded actually kind of coming up out of the water on rainy nights and hunting around. And so it might be that in the larval stage, they sort of check out their environment. And if there isn't a lot of cover, if the environment is really arid and dry, or maybe there isn't a lot of prey available, that they might end up staying in the water for their adult life as well as these neotenic adults. So this year is atypical. Things dried up really, really quickly. And so normally we talk about amphibians this time of year, but it's been a really dry year. So a lot of amphibians have already kind of disappeared. But next year, when you're moving around during the wet season, keep in mind that pretty much any habitat you're in Marin County, you have the opportunity or the possibility of finding at least one species. So thanks for tuning in. And if you want to learn more about county parks and what we offer, visit our website. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. All right. Back to Sierran.
Hi, everyone. Well, welcome back. That was a wonderful lecture with lots of information. Got 2 thumbs up from Sybil. Thank you. So I have some questions for you. I'm just going to go back. There was one early on. And of course, anyone else, if you have a question, please just type it in the chat and I'll read it out and Shannon will respond. So first of all, thanks for doing this, Shannon. Do newts come out even when there's a cold spell? There were a lot out and then they disappeared in the cold spell.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think of them being more dependent upon moisture than temperature. But I do know that, for instance, the foothill yellow-legged frog aren't very active when it's really cold. And so that may apply to other amphibians as well. I don't know specifically about newts, but it could make sense that when it's really, really cold, it's just too cold for them to be active.
Okay, thank you. Allison asked about the tree frog size. I think at the different stages. I think we saw the littlest one.
Yeah, so the adults don't get very big. They get, maybe the females might get like from snout to vent like 2 inches or so. They're small.
Okay, thank you. Nice comment, fantastic talk, informative and great photos. And then wonderful to see the differences between various amphibians in Marin. Thanks so much. So some really nice appreciation there. Any more questions? There was a lot of information to take in. A lot of variety. I didn't realize there were so many amphibians in Marin.
And they're all kind of doing something slightly different, you know.
Yeah, the variations were really interesting, actually. Oh, here's a great question. What is being done to control bullfrogs?
Good question. So I don't really know the specifics of what is being done in different places. I think some people are trying to trap them, capture them, and then eradicate them. I think they're difficult to control because, so I don't think I mentioned, they are native to the eastern half of the US, and they typically, So yeah, they're typically found in permanent bodies of water, and one of the main ways to get rid of them, because their larval stage is so long, is to actually like drain a pool or a pond so that it dries out, and then that interrupts their life cycle. But I don't know that much about controlling them. I don't at this point. I don't believe that county parks is doing any specific things, taking any specific actions to control them, but I'm actually not sure. Allison, I could check in with our biologist and get back to you.
Okay. So you could email either Shannon or I if you want for more information. I would forward it to Shannon because I don't know, but I would certainly forward it on. There's another question. Is it harmful to newts if humans touch them or hold them?
That's a great question. So yeah, and that reminds me of something that I didn't say either, which I'll really quickly say. Handling a newt, you would have to eat a newt, or somehow the toxin would have to get into your bloodstream in order for it to be fatal. If you handle a newt, it's recommended that you wash your hands off afterwards, especially before you eat or something. Anecdotally, I have handled newts and then eaten a sandwich and I haven't died. So, but it's a good practice. But handling amphibians is something that's better not to do too much of, because they have that permeable membrane. Their skin is permeable, and so if you have anything on your hands, it could be germs, but also like sunscreen or lotion or anything like that gets absorbed through their skin. And so a lot of times, if I'm going to handle an amphibian, like for educational purposes, I'll rub my hands in dirt and also get them wet and stuff. And so even if you're holding an amphibian, just the dryness of your hands can sort of, cause a little bit of desiccation. So yeah, it's, they definitely can, it can be detrimental to them to handle them too much. And also they can absorb like pesticides and herbicides and things like that in their skin, which is bad for them.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Is there an antitoxin for newt poisoning that is commonly available in local hospitals or with vets? It's a great question.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. And my understanding is that that things happen pretty quickly if something were to ingest them. And so I don't know how much time there would be in order, to get them somewhere and to get some sort of antitoxin. But I haven't heard of an antitoxin.
So caution would be the
yeah
best approach.
Yeah, keep an eye on your dogs for sure.
Yeah. Here's an interesting question. I found a giant salamander at about 5,000 feet in snow country. You said they need cold water. So are they very rare in Marin, and is it getting too warm for them?
Great questions. Typically here in like shaded canyons, and as long as you have fast moving water, so they breed in the winter. They breed like November through March, whereas a lot of our other amphibians are breeding a little bit later. So after big storms come through, they're breeding when things are really cold and there's a fair amount of water moving. And when you have a volume of water, that means it's moving more quickly, and that helps to keep it cool. When water is sort of sitting in shallow places, it heats up from the sun, and so it raises the water temperature. But so they're breeding during times when the water, even here in Marin, and again, they're typically in kind of shaded canyons, the water's cold enough for them. But yeah, regarding climate change, it definitely will be impacting a lot of our amphibians.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too. Here's another wonderful question comment. Maybe you said it and I missed it, but what do the immature aquatic salamanders that you featured right at the end of your talk eat, who have enough water to mostly stay in the water?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. So I'll give two answers. The newts and the giant salamander larvae are both eating little invertebrates, little aquatic invertebrates, little bugs and stuff, and that are in the water. And even the giant salamander larvae are pretty big, and so they will eat tadpoles, they'll eat the larvae of other amphibians, they'll eat fish, things like that. And so that might be what the question was about. If it was about the lungless salamanders that go through the larval stage in the egg, they're actually living off of the egg yolk. They're sustained. That's one reason why their eggs are so big, because they've got a really big yolk sac.
Thank you. Hopefully that covers both sides, but if not, Anne, just ask a clarifying question. Are there any more questions? I know you touched on climate change a little bit. Is there more to say on that? That was kind of something I was interested in. Have we observed changes in the population or in the habits of some of the amphibians based on climate change?
I don't know of any particular studies, but I would say that, for instance, this year, our winters are really, really changing. Like when we get water, how much we get water, even like having bigger storms can dislodge eggs and flush eggs and things like that too. But obviously in a year like this, where things just got dry really early, like this is typically amphibian season kind of, I've just noticed that, for instance, the slender salamanders that normally if you were to turn over a log, in the last month or so, you would have a really good chance of finding slender salamanders under it. And I have found hardly any. I found one yesterday. It was in a shaded canyon, but for the most part, I'm not seeing them. And so they have just kind of disappeared. In areas where you typically get a lot of frog eggs and toad eggs, I'm seeing very, very few. And so I think what's happening is some amphibians, they can be pretty long-lived. And so they can forego reproducing some years, if it's just too dry, or if they haven't gotten enough to eat, because maybe there isn't enough moisture for them to be out foraging and getting food. So if it dries up, that means that they're not going to come out of, so in the summertime when they're kind of hunkered down and not eating much, that's called estivation. That's kind of like hibernation, but they're avoiding drying out. But anyway, so they're not really feeding. So they need a period to come out and be eating. And if things are really dry, then that limits how long they can be active. And so in general, I think there's very good reason to think that the breeding season may become shorter, fewer animals may be breeding. And I don't know what that means ultimately, but obviously it's not good news.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very thorough answer. And here's another question. Has anyone noted what creatures live in and around Willow Creek in Sausalito? There is an effort to sunlight the creek that has been previously channeled. It is local, not county, but just wondering.
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with it, so I can't add any.
Okay, but I guess worth a look-see. Well, with that, it's 11:03. So before we leave and thank Shannon, I just want to mention that Shannon has generously agreed to give another talk with me at the library on May 9th from 10 to 11. She's going to be talking about backyard birds. So you can go to our website to sign up, marinlibrary.org, and I think you can sign up on the parks as well. And just a reminder that this talk will be on our YouTube channel, the Marin County Free Library YouTube channel, within a couple of weeks. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye, and just generous thanks to Shannon again for so clearly sharing so much information about so many different local creatures. So big thanks to you, and I hope you and everyone here has a wonderful day today.
Thanks, Shereen. It's always fabulous to partner with you on these. And thanks to everybody for tuning in.
All right. Bye, everyone. Have a great day.